Welcome back. I am absolutely thrilled to have you here for this explainer. Today, we're setting the stage for a fascinating, highly structured journey through the history of East Africa's largest country, Tanzania. We're going to break down the complex historical, economic, and social shifts that took Tanzania from a colonized territory to the vibrant modern nation it is today. Let's dive right in. Okay, let's look at our roadmap for this explainer. We're going to cover from colonies to independence, the Union and Julius Nyerere, Ujamaa, the socialist experiment, economic and social transformations, modern politics and challenges, and finally, heritage, environment, and future. Let's get right to it. From colonies to independence. To really understand Tanzania today, we've got to look at its sheer geographic scale and how its modern borders were shaped by some pretty rapid colonial shifts. Back in 1884, German colonialists set up German East Africa, using treaties with the Sultan of Zanzibar to secure the land. But after Germany lost World War I, control abruptly shifted. By 1920, the territory, now known as Tanganyika, fell under a British mandate. The British ruled for over 4 decades, but eventually, a multinational struggle and a constitutional conference over in London paved the way for self-rule. And finally, on December 9, 1961, Tanganyika won its hard-fought independence. And this leads us to one of the country's absolute most incredible achievements. Tanzania is massively diverse. We're talking roughly 120, and some estimates even say up to 140 distinct ethnic groups, each with their own language. Yet unlike so many newly independent nations that unfortunately fractured along ethnic lines, Tanzania found early unity. How? Through a single lingua franca, Swahili. By making Swahili the national and official language, they effectively bridged the communication gap right across this massive territory. It was a real game changer. Moving on to Section 2, the Union and Julius Nyerere. So with independence secured, the map of East Africa literally changed. As we know, the massive mainland, Tanganyika, gained independence in 1961. But just off the coast was Zanzibar, a small yet strategically vital island nation. Well, in January 1964, Zanzibar went through a violent revolution that actually overthrew its Arab-led government. And then, just months later, in a totally unique historical merger, the vast mainland and the revolutionary islands joined forces to form the United Republic of Tanzania. It's actually the only nation formed from a merger of 2 independent states quite like this. At the helm of this brand new union was President Julius Nyerere. And Nyerere is such a fascinating historical figure. The sources really paint him as a complex, polarizing leader. On one hand, you have this pragmatic idealist, someone who was deeply, honestly committed to egalitarian values and lifting people out of poverty. But on the other hand, historians point out his reliance on heavy-handed, top-down governance to actually force that vision into reality. So you get this intense tension between his noble goals and his strict methods, and that dynamic completely defined the country's first few decades. Which brings us to Section 3, Ujamaa, the socialist experiment. That strict top-down vision really crystallized into one defining philosophy, Ujamaa. Announced by Nyerere in the famous 1967 Arusha Declaration, Ujamaa literally translates to familyhood. This was a uniquely African brand of socialism. It wasn't just an economic policy, it was an all-encompassing social contract. The overarching goal? To build a society entirely based on collective cooperation. The idea was that people would work and produce together, almost like one giant extended family, all while staying fiercely self-reliant so they wouldn't fall under the control of foreign powers. When we break down the manifesto itself, we can see exactly what the government was demanding. First, they wanted absolute self-reliance. They promised equal individual development, meaning the idea was that even the poorest, most remote villages could thrive if everyone cooperated. But in return, the state expected active citizen duty. Basically, everyone was required to put in the hard work, primarily in agriculture and industry. Why? Because agricultural growth was singled out as the absolute foundation of the nation's entire economy. Now, to actually achieve all of this, the government kicked off a villagization program of just staggering proportions. By 1980, 9 million people had been moved from their traditional homes and resettled into over 8,000 newly established Ujamaa villages. Just to put that into perspective for a second, that was the equivalent of 97% of the entire rural population of Tanzania at the time. It was an absolute demographic earthquake, specifically designed to enforce collective farming and centralize government services. All right, Section 4, Economic and Social Transformations. Naturally, when you restructure your entire national ideology and move 97% of your rural population, you're going to see some massive economic transformations. And the contrast over the decades is stark. Back in the 1970s, under Ujamaa, Tanzania operated a strictly closed socialist economy. Multinational companies were nationalized, banks were taken over by the state, and prices were strictly frozen. But fast forward past the 1990s, and the script completely flips. After liberalizing its markets, Tanzania transitioned into one of the most open economies in all of Africa, triggering this massive influx of cross-border trade, private investment, and a really flourishing informal business sector. Right alongside the economy, the state was also totally re-engineering its social services. The goal was to deliberately break away from old colonial systems and empower people at the grassroots level. For example, the 1962 Education Act unified the schooling system and made Swahili the mandatory primary language of instruction. And in healthcare, instead of just relying on massive urban hospitals, they decentralized. They focused on training village health workers to bring basic, demand-driven healthcare straight to rural communities. They even poured heavy investment into state-owned hotels and lodges to make absolutely sure that Tanzanians, not foreign corporations, controlled the very lucrative tourism sector. Moving into Section 5, Modern Politics and Challenges. Politically speaking, the landscape has evolved quite a bit, though some key elements have definitely stuck around. In 1992, Tanzania officially transitioned from a single-party state to a multi-party system. However, the ruling party, the CCM, has kept a pretty tight grip on power ever since independence. Our sources note that the 2020 elections were highly controversial, with the CCM allegedly sweeping over 99% of the vote in both Zanzibar and the mainland, which obviously sparked a massive outcry from the opposition. Then, following the sudden passing of President Magufuli in 2021, Vice President Samia Suluhu Hassan assumed the presidency, and she's been navigating this complex, ever-shifting political landscape ever since. So, the crucial point here is understanding the paradox at the heart of Tanzania's modern economy. On one hand, Tanzania is an incredible success story. We're looking at an average annual GDP growth rate of over 7% across the last 15 years, making it literally one of the fastest-growing emerging economies in the world. Yet, paradoxically, roughly 26% of the population still lives in extreme poverty. Factors like high population growth and a decline in agricultural productivity make it incredibly difficult to translate that impressive, top-level GDP growth into actual grassroots wealth for everyday people. And another major systemic hurdle to that development is corruption. Looking at data from the Transparency International CPI index cited in our sources, corruption is unfortunately a pervasive issue. When surveyed, a staggering 72% of respondents admitted to having personal experience with corruption, things like being asked for a bribe. Furthermore, 42% view it as a moderate problem, while 7% see it as a massive hurdle. This kind of systemic issue erodes business efficiency and shakes public confidence, which directly impacts both the national economy and everyday life. Finally, Section 6, Heritage, Environment, and Future. Now, despite these developmental challenges, Tanzania holds onto an undeniable asset that completely drives its global presence, its vast natural heritage. And honestly, the nation has been incredibly strategic about it. Way back in the 1920s, the industry was heavily dominated by extractive, big-game hunting safaris tailored for wealthy foreigners. But Tanzania course-corrected. In 1951, the Serengeti was officially gazetted as the first national park, and by the 1970s, the government led a deliberate paradigm shift away from hunting, focusing instead on environmentally friendly sightseeing and ecotourism. And this pivot pulled off massively. By the 2000s, they were seeing a rapid surge of over 370,000 visitors annually. But of course, that highly profitable biodiversity isn't entirely safe. The sources warn that Tanzania's prime wildlife destinations face severe contemporary threats. We're talking about climate change, rapid shifts in land cover, and unchecked development, especially things like potential oil and gas exploration. If these threats aren't managed incredibly carefully, the delicate ecosystems that support both the nation's cultural heritage and its massive tourism revenue could be irreparably damaged. Which brings us to a final, pretty provocative thought. We've seen a nation transition from a colonized territory to a fiercely independent socialist experiment, and now into a fast-growing liberalized economy. But that central paradox remains. Can Tanzania successfully leverage its immense natural wealth and that impressive 7% economic growth to finally overcome its deep-rooted hurdles of poverty and governance? It's a complex question for sure, but understanding the structure of their history gives us the absolute best lens to watch their future unfold. Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer. Keep your curiosity sharp, and I'll catch you next time.